We can't use an atom of it. It's locked up when it's in the air. It's a dead molecule. We're like people in a boat on the ocean dying of thirst.
So this is where Fritz Haber, a German chemist, enters the picture. What does he do?
Like many chemists around the world, he heard this.
Please keep to the right in 300 yards onto A11.
In which he could turn nitrogen in the air into a reactive nitrogen molecule. He made a product called ammonia, and the ammonia has the nitrogen form.
Now keep to the right.
Be altered into various fertilizers.
I just want to hit pause here and tell you how momentous this is. Because in order to make atmospheric nitrogen, break its bond and reform with hydrogen to make ammonium nitrate, in other words, plant-friendly food, you need to create temperatures of up to 650 degrees centigrade. And there's also immense pressures involved, something like going 2 kilometers underwater.
He sold his idea to a very large chemical company in Germany, BASF, and BASF in turn...
Please keep to the right in 300 yards onto A11.
...demonstration machine into a machine that was the size of a couple of city blocks. Wow. They made a huge factory. The person who oversaw that process was another chemist.
Now keep to the right.
Together, they created a new industry. Originally, they wanted to feed the world, except that in 1914, World War I started.
As you may have already gathered after watching the Beirut videos, ammonium nitrate is highly explosive. So before it made it out into the fields in any meaningful way, it was used by the Germans to make munitions during the First World War. Once the war was over, the victors scrabbled to understand how Haber and Bosch had made not only this magic fertilizer that could make bread from air, but also bombs from air.
And it took years to do it, but eventually the secret was found out, and people started building Haber-Bosch plants everywhere.
Please follow the road for 2.5 miles.
About almost
traffic jam ahead on A1211.
Most people don't realize that somewhere near them is a Haber-Bosch plant. We should all thank Fritz Haber and Karl Bosch every time we take a bite of food.
Needless to say that after the Second World War, production shifted to making this explosive white powder for explosive plant growth. New high-yield varieties came about because it was now possible to douse them in fertilizer. More and more food was grown, and many Western figures cast aside their worries of famine. But
actually we overlook nitrogen, especially with food production. Only since about 30-40 years, at least in the Netherlands, we became aware that nitrogen is really an issue environmentally in many different aspects.
Meet our next guest.
I'm Jan Willem Eerdersman. I live in the Netherlands, in The Hague. I'm affiliated to the University of Leiden, to the Institute of Environmental Sciences, and I became professor in environmental sustainability.
Jan's been fixated on nitrogen for more than 3 decades, partly because he was worried about how it was damaging our planet.
Well, the production itself requires natural gas, and with the production CO2 is released, so by producing fertilizer you also produce greenhouse gases. Also nitrous oxide gas is produced to some extent, so it's about, say 1.5 and 2% of the total global greenhouse gas emissions directly related to fertilizer production.
But the energy cost associated with producing nitrogen fertilizers isn't the only problem. When it's sprayed onto fields, a lot of it doesn't end up in the plants. In fact, only 30 to 70% is taken up by the crop, and the remaining nitrogen is causing a lot of problems.
Well, there are several issues in the soil also related to climate change. Because if you just put in chemical fertilizer, it burns up the organic matter in the soil. So gradually you lose CO2 from the soil because you apply fertilizer. That's one thing. And of course, if you overload the soil with nitrogen and phosphorus, it leaches out to the groundwater and to the surface water and pollutes and leads to eutrophication.
Eutrophication is when fertilizers enrich the rivers in the same way that they enrich the soils. The aquatic algae grow and grow, sucking up a lot of the oxygen in the water and suffocating the fish and a lot of the other aquatic life that live there. It creates so-called dead zones, where very little life lives. Jan tells me that these dead zones are on the rise. In the 60s, there were just a handful, and today, a third of the world's estuaries are dead.
Since 10 years, we have the availability of satellite images of nitrogen, and then talking about ammonia emissions from agriculture. And you see a huge increase in areas like the Midwest of the US, Eastern China, the north of India, which are much larger polluting areas, and those are the areas where the agricultural production also boosted.
Do you think the climate crisis is as serious as the problems we're facing with nitrogen?
Until now, climate change has been catastrophic in certain places, but mainly economically. Whereas nitrogen really leads to biodiversity loss, and biodiversity loss is something that you cannot repair. So nitrogen is really a slow building up, I wouldn't say killer, but at least a very important environmental pollutant.
This is The Food Chain from the BBC World Service. I'm Greg Jackson, and this week we're exploring the history of nitrogen fertilizers. Nitrogen is a paradoxical compound then, giving life as easily as it takes. It's enabled us to feed our growing populations, but has been used in warfare and is polluting our planet, contributing to climate change and the loss of biodiversity. Today, global levels of man-made nitrogen now exceed natural nitrogen, and this imbalance is likely to get worse. Demand for nitrogen fertilizers has been increasing over the last couple of decades and is expected to double in the coming century.
So we produce approximately 20 million tons of fertilizer. We have 28 production plants, so that's at 28 different locations, and is sold into 160 countries worldwide.
This is Tove Andersen, Vice President for the European branch of Yara. And as you've just heard, Yara is one of the biggest hitters in the fertilizer business. They have 7% of the global market share.
We actually started the fertilizer production in 1905, so we have been in this business for more than 100 years.
And during those 100 years, they've consumed vast amounts of fossil fuels, specifically natural gas.
Yeah, so we are a significant consumer of natural gas. In Europe, actually, Yara is the largest industrial buyer of natural gas.
It seems like the energy demand of producing fertilizer has a huge cost to the earth. And I wondered, how do you justify its use?
So if you look at the global consumption of food, if you are not using a mineral fertilizer, you would actually produce half of the food that is produced currently, which means that you need to increase the land area significantly. If you look at global greenhouse gas emissions, approximately a quarter comes from food production and land use change. And it's only 1 to 2% that comes from fertilizer production. So actually it's more important to ensure that we optimize food production on the existing land. And in order to do that, mineral fertilizer is part of a solution.
1 to 2% is still really high though. I mean, if you think about that in terms of global energy consumption, do you have plans to switch to a more sustainable energy source in the future, not relying on gas?
Yes, I agree with you, and we need to tackle that. And today we use hydrogen from natural gas. But actually you can use hydrogen from water, and you can use renewable electricity to be able to take that hydrogen from the water. So then you could produce fertilizer from nitrogen from air, renewable energy, and there will be zero carbon emissions.
And that's feasible?
That is feasible. The technology is there today. The issue is that it is more expensive. So if you just look at ammonia production, that will cost 3-4 times as much as it costs today. The important thing here is then to work with the value chain, to work with the food value chain, so that we get everybody on board, so that we can make sure that then the farmers can get paid for making them more sustainable.
And so the production of the fertilizer is one problem, but the other problem is the application of nitrogen fertilizers, in that there are lots of environmental issues surrounding it. So what does a company like Yara do to ameliorate that end of the situation?
So we have more than 1,000 agronomists working for us, which has their main mission is to give advice for farmers on, first of all, what products to use, when it should be used, how it should be used, so to make sure that it's applied in the correct way. For example, sensors. So we have sensors that the farmer can use, because when you apply fertilizer to a field, you shouldn't apply the same everywhere. You need to apply where it is missing or where it's required, unless you're not going to get the efficiency.
Everyone we spoke to for this show agreed that we need to reduce our use of nitrogen fertilizers, but there are some who are shunning them altogether.
My name is Flores New. I'm a cacao organic grower in Samoa.
Flores told me that her family had been growing cacao for 5 generations, along with bananas, pineapples and root vegetables like taro, chimera, commonly known as sweet potatoes, manioc and tamu, you might know that as the giant yam, all of which she farms organically. But in Samoa, Flores is something of an outlier. Back in the 70s and 80s, most of her neighbours switched from the old ways that Flores is reliant on to nitrogen-heavy farming. By the way, if you're wondering about the music in the background, Flores had to travel to a nearby hotel bar to get Wi-Fi to speak to us.
I have memories of my great-grandfather, who died at 120, who had made my parents swear not to use this, to have this interference of chemicals be sprayed on our land, for a very, very good reason, and that was to keep the land sacred, because we don't own the land. The land does not belong to us. We belong to the land, and this is the belief that I grew up with, and it's something very, very deeply emotional and important to me.
Flores tells me this spiritual connection to the land is called tapu. Tapu is an old Polynesian tradition which centres on respecting people, natural resources and the environment. And she pays tribute to the soil by treasuring it, protecting it and enriching it in the same way her ancestors did, with rotation crops.
They used to have a saying that when the taro finishes, the bananas will answer. When the banana finishes, the tamu will answer, or this will answer. And that basically means that we just go around in a circle. Umala or kuma takes 4 months to grow, to become mature.
In half a mile, tell them ahead.
Good for the soil, because then after that, then I can put in my pineapples, and then I can put in, maybe some taro later on, and maybe 12 to 14 months after the taro, then you put in something else. You have to have, all of those things to work in harmony with each other. You can't know it until you sit there and watch it on a daily basis and know what each plant is doing for another. Going back to the lab and getting all this fertilizers and trying to work with these fertilizers, how could you ever be intuitive with fertilizers?
But not many people in Flores's community.
In a quarter of a mile, tell them ahead.
I think that kind of upset many people in the community, especially those with high positions like in elders, chiefs in the village, who make all the decisions about the land.
And so does that mean it's hard for you to find staff that will work in the way that you want them to work?
Absolutely. I probably have been through 3 or 4 villages trying to find permanent staff that are able to understand organics. I've tried to inspire the local people by bringing woofers. These are organic farmhands, people who travel and are really passionate about farming organically or learning about organic farming, and I bring those people in and they stay with me for a couple of months, and I get them to work alongside the locals so that the locals get inspired by them as well, and vice versa.
But Floris admits that her dream of inspiring locals to grow organically will be tough, because the soil won't recover its natural fertility quickly.
To have the soil really back in good form would take maybe between 5 to 7 years. And I know that might sound like it's not feasible, but I think now that we have this sort of lag during the global pandemic, I think people can go back to the land and really think hard about what they need to do to bring their land back.
I wanted to know whether Floris's organic dreams are realistic, especially on a global scale. Could we do away with nitrogen fertilizers and feed a growing population? Tova and Thomas thought not.
These fertilizers have made it possible for us to overpopulate the earth. Very simply put, without Haber Bosch, we would have never had the food that we have to feed the population that we have now. The human population is still rising, and we're going to add another 2 or 3 billion people between now and the end of this century. And we're going to have to depend on Haber Bosch to do it. That looks inevitable.
So there is a lot of scientific studies that show that you will not be able to feed the population today on organic farming, because there is such a big yield gap. So you would then need to compensate by increasing the land area significantly.
And Jan agrees, but says that we need to reduce nitrogen fertilizers as much as possible. And he thinks one way to do this would be to change the way we farm, making sure we keep the nutrient cycle closed and locked in at a local level, much like we did before we had the Haber Bosch process.
More use the natural processes in the soil, in the landscape elements, the biodiversity, the soil life, for example. Use grassland where there is grassland, and use that for dairy systems, and produce crops where best crops fit in, and then use the natural processes. And then, to replace nutrients, you might add fertilizer, but then you lose much less than you do now, and the risk of losses to the environment are also much lower.
So by using natural processes that exist in nature, working with the landscapes that suit our crops and animals, we can reduce our reliance on man-made fertilizers.
Please turn left in 300 yards onto A1213, then keep to the right.
The only ones. Jan recognises that change needs to happen all along the food chain, governments, industry and consumers. And a lot of it comes down to something we come back to often on the food chain, paying for the true cost of food, a cost that incorporates the damage that it does to the environment.
I believe that every person is willing to do the best for the environment, but once he looks at the price in the supermarket, he chooses the cheapest. If you internalize the external costs, so make products that pollute more expensive, and subsidize the more sustainable farmers, that helps the consumer to make the choice for the more sustainable products.
But I mean, we're in the middle of a pandemic, there's lots of unemployment, people are very worried about money. I wonder whether this is actually feasible.
Yeah, that's a good point. On the other hand, we already pay the damage that we make by producing food, but in an indirect way through the taxes. So yeah, it is an economic situation that we have to change. So food would become more expensive, but the taxes overall would become lower.
What is it that you try to do to make a difference?
I'm a vegetarian for 30 years already. I use as much as possible sustainable energy. I have the solar power panels on my roof. I transport by public transport. I even reduced flying to zero, not only for nitrogen, but also for climate change. So there's a lot you can do, and I'm still happy.
Well, that's good to hear. And Thomas thinks there could be some clever technological...
Now turn left.
There's a revolution in agriculture going on now.
Please keep to the right in 80 yards onto A1213, then turn left. Now keep to the right.
Find out how much nitrogen is being put into the system as pollution rather than as fertilizer.
Grid recalculation.
And we monitor our use of fertilizer, we can get out of this dilemma. We can feed the world without polluting it to death.
Now turn right.
That's all for this week. Do let us know what you think about the show. You can email the food chain at bbc.co.uk or get in touch with me on Twitter or Instagram. I'm at Greer Jackson. From me and the rest of the team, that's Sarah Stollart and Simon Tudor.
Route recalculation.
So make sure you join her at the same time next week. Goodbye.
This is the BBC World Service, and on this month's World Book Club,
Please turn left in 200 yards onto A100.
Strout joins me to answer questions about her novel, Olive Kittredge.
What interests me as a writer is going into not the good or the bad, but the murkiness of what makes a character a person.
World Book Club with Elizabeth Strout at bbcworldservice.com/World Book Club. And in 60 minutes, the newsroom with Valerie Sanderson.
We're in Lesbos, where thousands of migrants are trying to survive following the destruction of their camp by fire. In Belarus, the detained opposition leader Maria Kolesnikova describes her treatment by the authorities. The fires sweeping America's west coast.
Outlook is next. This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
Today, Thomas McBee writes about masculinity and the global masculinity crisis. He transitioned to a male body in adulthood and immediately noticed a major social difference.
I'd be walking down the street and it's like women would move out of my way, whereas men wouldn't. And then when I would get to work, I noticed that if I spoke in a meeting, everybody would stop talking. And then, of course, that meant that it was so much easier to interrupt people, which wasn't my intent. I was suddenly in the most valuable body in America.
To understand the very nature of masculinity, he signed up to a boxing match at Madison Square Garden, training himself to want to hit people.
They said, yeah, we have a hole in the fight card. As long as you can prove that you can keep on your feet and not get knocked out, then let's do it. Let's make this happen. You can fight in Madison Square Garden in 5.5 months.
The story of a trans man on a journey to discover the relationship
Now
between
turn left.
masculinity and violence on Outlook after the news.
Hello, I'm Debbie Russ with the BBC News. The foremost opposition activist still inside Belarus, Maria Kolesnikova, has said she was threatened with death by the KGB intelligence service agents who tried to deport her illegally this week. She said she was told that if she didn't leave voluntarily, they would remove her anyway, alive or in pieces. Sarah Rainsford reports from Moscow.
It's 3 days since Maria Kolesnikova was bundled into a van on the streets of Minsk by security forces. Now in custody, the opposition activist has described how her captors pressured her to leave Belarus. When Ms. Kolesnikova refused to leave, she says she had a bag placed over her head.
Please keep to the left in 300 yards onto A1211, then keep to the left.
To be opened against the KGB and police officers involved for kidnap, unlawful detention and death threats.
Reports from Germany say the poisoned Russian opposition activist Alexei Navalny is able to speak again after being brought out of an induced coma earlier this week. Der Spiegel magazine said that his police protection at a Berlin hospital had been stepped up, as he may soon be in a position to tell investigators what happened. Thousands of migrants are stranded on the Greek island of Lesbos after a second fire in 2 days destroyed what was left of their makeshift camp. The overcrowded Mori camp was home to some 13,000 people. Here's Bethany Bell in Lesbos.
I'm on one of the roads leading to the camp, which has been closed off by police. There are migrants and refugees sitting on the road. There's a woman not very far away from where I am with a little baby lying on the pavement. There are a whole other group of people who've told us they're from Afghanistan. The people we spoke to said that they tried to go back to the camp.
Now keep to the left.
The authorities told them they couldn't go there. They spent the night here at the side of the road under the olive trees. And
please keep to the left in 100 yards onto A1211, then turn left. Now keep to the left.
To offset the damage caused by the coronavirus pandemic, the group's airlines,
now turn left,
Iberia of Spain and Aer Lingus of Ireland have cancelled tens of thousands of flights. Andrew Walker reports.
In the first 6 months of 2020, IAG's revenue from passengers was 60% lower than a year earlier. That led to a loss of more than $4 billion. The outlook for the aviation industry is
please turn left in 30 yards.
Shareholders to reinforce its financial position. There have also been job cuts at IAG subsidiaries as they seek to reduce costs. One of its airlines, British Airways, says it has reached an agreement in principle with a trade union in a bitter dispute about redundancies and reducing pay.
Andrew Walker reporting. You're listening to the World News from the BBC. The European Commission has sent one of its vice presidents to London to question the British government on new legislation that overrides a previous agreement and breaks international law. Maros,
please turn right in 20 yards.
The full details of the withdrawal agreement, both parties
now turn left.
Expected. The outcome of the meeting will affect the future of the talks between the EU and Britain about a trade agreement. A dispute over a law to protect Australia's endangered koalas is threatening to topple the government in the state of New South Wales. Michael Bristow has the details.
The National Party was the junior coalition partner in the government of Australia's most populous state, and it's withdrawn its support over legislation introduced last December to better protect the koala's habitat. It says the law prevents farmers from clearing their land. Crisis talks have taken place to resolve what's been dubbed the Koala War. In June, an inquiry found the marsupial will be extinct by 2050 unless urgent action was taken. Koalas were among an estimated 3 billion animals killed or injured in last summer's bushfires in Australia.
The Eritrean government is reported to have released more than 20 prisoners on bail who had been in detention for years because of their faith. Only 4 religious groups are officially recognised in Eritrea: Christian Orthodox, the Catholic Church, the Lutheran Church and Sunni Islam. Sources have told the BBC that the freed prisoners are from the banned Christian Evangelical and Pentecostal denominations. The Eritrean government has not commented. The Iranian Navy has begun a major exercise near the strategically vital Strait of Hormuz at what is a time of high tension with the United States. Warships, submarines and aircraft will take part in the 3-day operation. The Iranians have warned foreign aircraft, especially US drones, to stay away from the area. That's the latest BBC News.
Hello, I'm Anu Anand, and you're with Outlook on the BBC World Service, the place to come for amazing life stories. Today, we're dropping into a boxing ring in Madison Square Garden in the heart of New York City.
Ladies and gentlemen, Thomas McPhee.
Thomas Page McBee is entering the ring, squaring up for a big fight. This is an epic day for Thomas. He's only been boxing for 5.5 months, but he's not here just for the glory. He wants to understand the relationship between masculinity and violence. Thomas is an award-winning writer. He's also a trans man who transitioned in adulthood. His journey means he's especially sensitive to how society perceives gender. He wants to know exactly what it means to, quote, be a man. The question begins in earnest late one evening as he's heading home from a night out with his then girlfriend. Just a heads up, later in this conversation we discuss the sexual abuse of a child. But now let's join Thomas on that walk home.
I was in Oakland, California, where I was living at the time with my ex, and she and I were coming back from San Francisco, and we exited at our train stop, and we had like a long walk home, I think it was like a 1.5-mile walk, and it was kind of late, and we took these kind of neighborhood residential side streets, and all was well until it wasn't anymore, and sort of the next thing I knew, I was being tackled from behind by a man who went on to among us.
And this guy, it's not really clear what he wants, but you guys are really, really scared. I mean, there's definitely some kind of malicious intent.
Yeah, I mean, it was before my transition, but I had a very sort of masculine aesthetic. And I felt very sure as we were being months that this man definitely not a guy. He had tackled me, and then he ignored, in a way that was kind of odd. She could have just run, really. I mean, he really acted like she didn't exist at all. And then he held me at gunpoint with like a gun in my hand, like on the street for a long time. And obviously time kind of expands in those moments, but it was at least 5 to 10 minutes of just this man who also seemed like he wasn't cognitively ready. Like he seemed high. We weren't having our like shared reality. Like he definitely wanted to talk. I was just sort of frozen with this gun in my hand. I was pretty sure I was.
And then you spoke, and everything changed. What happened?
Yeah, so like, my partner had kept at the time, she kept saying like, we don't have money, we don't have cash, and I couldn't speak. I felt like totally frozen. At some point, she sort of looked at me kind of pleadingly, and I realized like I needed to say something, so I also said, we don't have any cash. As soon as I spoke, he just put his gun down and he said, run. And we did. I felt very sure that it was because when I spoke at that point, prior to my transition, I wasn't a man for the world yet. So he read me as female, and then because of that, he let me go.
And he later went on to shoot 2 other men, and one of them died. So your instinct about that was right. What did that incident do to you? What did it tell you about who you were?
Now turn right.
Shocking situation all the way around. I mean, what happened was, once he let me go and once we ran, it was sort of like a series of events happened that oddly were like affirming to me and positive. So even though this mugging itself was so traumatic, then later on, like having it confirmed that he really did have.
Please follow the road for 1.5 miles.
First of all, in this weird way, he saw me as a man, which I think on some level I felt seen by him, like oddly. I knew my gender wasn't the one I was born in, but I just didn't totally understand if I wanted to transition or not. And in this odd way, it was very validating to be seen for who I was. And then when I spoke and it saved me, it was really oddly liberating to have like being female be a thing that actually helped me. And then when we ran, like there was something for me that felt like, it almost felt like as I was running, things were sort of falling back into place. Later I found out like when you run from a predator, your body can kind of release all that adrenaline, so it felt like biologically almost like, or physiologically, I was experiencing some sort of like reset. So even though the actual mugging was really upsetting and traumatizing, everything that kind of followed felt like it was about putting things back into place. Really by like the next day, I think I was starting to feel like, wow, I'm a man. Like I just felt like the whole experience actually helped me understand my gender in a clarifying way that I hadn't felt super clear on before that moment.
So the mugging basically kicked off a journey about who you were, who you wanted to be, what you were running towards. But before we talk about that, let's go back to your childhood, to your identity as it developed through childhood. How would you describe yourself as a kid?
Well, in terms of gender, I was a masculine kid. I guess people would have said a tomboy. I liked boyish things, but on the other hand, I was also like a sensitive kid. I started writing when I was 9 years old. I don't know, I think I was like a pretty thoughtful kid. I was a creative kid, and I was the oldest of 3 siblings, so definitely acted like an oldest. But mostly, I think I was just like frankly, just a younger version of what I am now. I was masculine and I think, artistic and sensitive.
And other people saw you that way too. Your siblings sometimes referred to you as older brother. You were escorted out of girls' bathrooms, so people saw you perhaps as more male than you biologically were?
Yeah, I mean, I think people generally, and certainly the people in my life, were very like kind of encouraging and supportive of my gender expression, which was, just like a masculine kid. Like that's the only way I can think to frame it. And then as I got older, there was less tolerance for, what we accept in kids, we don't love as much in adolescents and teens. And there certainly wasn't a language around being trans. So I think I realized at some point that the wider world didn't always understand that my gender was not the one I was born in, but my family and my immediate surroundings was always very supportive.
Now, I know you're not defined by this, but it's key to the journey in your book, and that is that you did expose him. Your mother found out, or you told her about the abuse.
Yeah, I actually told my babysitter first, but then she told my mom, and I was lucky that my mom believed me. I know that's not always what happens, and obviously she was devastated, and
please turn right in half a mile, then turn left.
She tried to give me some frameworks to understand what healing could look like. I mean, she obviously had no idea as a person who hadn't gone through the same experience, but I think she did a good job of introducing some thoughts to me as a kid that I still, frankly, think about all the time. Like right after I told her, we had this moment where she was really depressed. I mean, understandably, she was really sad. And I remember once, climbing into bed with her, and she said, "You have a golden core, and nobody can ever touch it." And I didn't even know I needed to hear that, and I don't even know if it made total sense to me at the time, but it's something I still think about all the time, this idea that there's something indestructible that we all have. I would call it dignity, and that you can carry that around, and maybe somebody can try to take that from you or try to break that down, but there's something fundamental in everybody that can't be destroyed. And I've really, truly never stopped thinking about that.
It's such a beautiful image, isn't it? A golden core. I can see why it meant so much to you and sort of helped you get through it. Once you told your mom, your dad apologized, a police chief came to speak to you about the abuse, and your parents eventually separated. And that, again, led you into a whole other journey with your family. You went on a journey to try and understand your father. You went to his home.
Please turn right in 300 yards onto Temple Place, then turn left.
I hadn't had any contact with my dad. I wasn't close to him or anything like that, but I just felt like I needed to face him, and I also needed to understand him. Because mainly I didn't want to end up like him. I mean, like most sons of bad dads, I didn't want to end up like my father. So I went to South Carolina, and I spent some time with his family and tried to kind of understand who he was. And also it was sort of a goodbye tour, because I felt pretty sure that once I did all this, I wasn't going to be in his life anymore. And so I wanted to kind of see these people I knew, understand how he grew up. And his life was really sad. He grew up very poor, and his older brother had killed himself. There was just a lot of trauma and death in his family. So I understood that a little bit better. And then I ended up going to see him as well, and talking to him about what had happened, and I don't know, trying to just sort of have a final dialogue, I guess, about why did he abuse me? What happened? What happened to him that made him want to hurt, his kid? I just wanted to understand that. And I think, again, to be really honest, it was that I didn't want to end up like him. So I really felt like if I could face that, which has sort of become a bigger theme in my life, if I can face the things I'm afraid of, or face the shadows, or face the darker parts, then I at least know I can shine the light on them, and then I can integrate it instead of running so far from it that maybe in the end I accidentally become like my worst fear.
And when you went to see him, the other complicating factor in terms of trying to work out who you were is the fact that you asked him for a paternity test. What was the result of that test, and how did that affect you?
Now turn right.
Feelings about seeing him?
Yeah, well, that was challenging. I mean, I asked him for a paternity test because I had known he wasn't my dad, because my mom had told me when I was in college that he was my stepfather and not my real father. But I was not totally sure. The story had become so confused and convoluted. She never had told me who my actual dad was, and she sort of claimed it was a one-night stand and so on, and all the information wasn't there. And I felt like I needed to just address with him, is there any chance that you are actually my dad, and that's what's going on? And he was very insistent that he wasn't. So once it was confirmed, though, I think, in some ways it was a big relief, and in another way it was really sad.
Now turn left.
But when you grow up thinking someone's your father, even if they're terrible, it's a loss to realize they're not, So I think that was painful, and also in obviously a different way, it was a huge relief.
And eventually he comes around to an apology. Mm-hmm. What did he say, and what was your feeling at that moment? Did you feel you could forgive him?
I didn't know if I could totally forgive him in the moment, but I appreciated that he could take some responsibility. You know, I think that was what was really hard, was that, you know, we never had that conversation. I think a lot of kids who are abused by their parents don't get to sit down and say, what the hell, you know, like, well, why did you do this to me and what happened? And I think I really did have I had an open mind because I knew it was the last time I was going to talk to him, and I had an open heart because I just needed to, put some closure in the situation. So it really wasn't about him, you know, but I appreciated that he, in a very small way, stepped up and decided to take a little bit more responsibility than he ever had before and acknowledge my pain. And I appreciated his apology. You know, if forgiveness means letting go of your own anger and pain so that you can shift that energy into something new, that is where I eventually got.
Having faced the abuse, Thomas was now ready to take the next step. He began his medical transition soon after in 2011. He changed his name and his pronouns. At the time, many books and articles were debating what it meant to be a man, and Thomas immersed himself in that debate.
I had moved back east. I'd been living on the West Coast. I'd moved back east and started a career in media. So I was like working in journalism at the time. This was like right after the Great Recession of 2008. It was also during a time that people were constantly talking about this idea of what people were calling the masculinity crisis. So as a journalist, I was looking at all these stories about men and masculinity and gender and the economic fallout and marriage markets and so on. And I was also experiencing my own transition. And so physically, I was feeling amazing. I was really convinced, I thankfully, that I actually was trans, which, you know, you don't know until you really are having that lived experience. So I was happy to discover that I definitely was right about myself and felt really good in my body and really happy. And then whenever I left my apartment, I felt like I was in an alternate universe around what being a man meant socially and in the world. And it was sometimes a really frustrating one, sometimes a really harrowing universe, and sometimes I felt really guilty about all the privileges I was experiencing now.
Let's talk about that in a minute. That is really fascinating, and I wonder if you were prepared for those social changes. The other thing that's happening at the time is that your mother has just died very suddenly and traumatically. And you were so close to her. There was so much love and survival there. How did that impact you?
Yeah, it was really, really hard. I mean, I think anybody who loses a parent before they're, you know, under the age of 40, it's not a life experience I don't think most of us are prepared for. And it was really hard, I think, because I was just getting to, you know, my mom was just getting to know me in this new and like evolving identity. And we didn't have a lot of time for that to sort of gel. And she did die very suddenly. And because of the moment that was for me, like it was, again, just a few years into my transition, I was really not, I didn't have my sea legs yet as a man. I was still developing as a human being, I think. You know, this is my early 30s. So the main thing that happened was that, which now in retrospect I totally understand, but at the time I didn't. I was really angry. Like I was so mad. But I also was a lot of other things. And then there's a way I'm being treated by the world where I feel like I can't express myself beyond this very specific range of emotions, for example. Like, so I'm in grief, and if I express anything but anger, it seems like it makes people very uncomfortable. And I think we're all talking about masculinity, at least in my world. We all were talking about this masculinity crisis, but we were sort of making this presumption in every conversation that what being a man meant was an obvious thing, or what men act like is just like a baseline that we can all agree on, with the grief piece being pushed towards anger and not feeling like I could communicate really anything else that was going on for me. I think that was a final straw.
Tell me about the social changes.
Now turn left.
That you were finding were suddenly being given to you.
Please keep to the right in 50 yards onto A4, then turn right.
And I would experience privilege. I understood that.
Please turn right in 200 yards onto A4, then turn left.
Looks like. And so the best ways I can usually think of are things that have to do with like work. So like on my way to work, if I was walking to my job in Manhattan, I'd be walking down the street and it's like women would move out of my way.
Now turn right.
And sometimes if it was like, you know, coming home from work late at night, women would cross the street to avoid me. I felt very aware that I was suddenly like this sort of weaponized body and this threat potentially, which was really upsetting. And obviously understandable, but I was really conscious of that. And then when I would get to work, even just a few months into my transition, as soon as I had a lower voice, like,
now turn left.
Everybody would stop talking. And I thought,
Route recalculation.
If I spoke, everybody would just stop talking.
Please keep to the left in 50 yards onto A4200, then turn left.
Which wasn't my intent. So simple things like that, but then also in a broader way, you know, I was clearly moving through the world with a lot more safety. It was sort of like that Eddie Murphy skit, White Like Me on Saturday Night Live, like where he suddenly is experiencing the world as a white person. like every time a black person leaves.
Now turn left.
You know, everyone's sitting silently, and then once the final black person leaves, it's like all these white people are like having
now turn right.
a gala basically on the city bus. And it's obviously like irreverent and a joke about white privilege, but I really felt like I was experiencing that level of privilege. It just felt like, wow, this is a whole world of men rewarding each other, and unconsciously, I was suddenly in the most valuable body in America.
Now turn left.
And you're going through this as an adult. I mean, you are fully conscious of these social cues and the whole idea of masculinity.
Now turn right.
And there's a moment, there's a confrontation that perfectly captures this tension where you don't intend to be aggressive or to be, you know, masculine in that way, and yet the world kind of reacts that way to you. What happened when you were taking a photograph of a restaurant?
Please turn left in 200 yards onto A40, then keep to the right.
The sort of map of what is acceptable male behavior, I mean, we know the terms like boys don't cry, or we teach boys and we socialize them very young to stay within those parameters. And then men police other men. Like that's kind of like what being a man is. So when you talk about real men, really what we're talking about is, are you sort of performing your masculinity in this box in the way you're supposed to? And if not,
now turn left.
And I was experiencing that too. I mean, because I was in grief, I felt very aware that nobody was touching me, for example. Even my own uncle told me at my mom's memorial, like, men shake hands, you know, rather than hug. So I felt very aware that even in a way that was, I think, often attempting to be helpful, I was being pushed into that man box more and more and more. And it really felt unhealthy to me. And that came to a head in Manhattan, again in 2015. A few months after my mom died, I was really, really upset, really angry. And I was walking around angry, and I knew that. I went down to get ice cream from my girlfriend, and I passed this place where, you know, I just thought I could take her to dinner. So I took a picture of the restaurant, and there was like a flash on my camera, which was like obviously an accident because who uses flash? And this dude just came coming out of nowhere, and he just was kind of drunk. I mean, he smelled kind of drunk too, but he was like a kind of disheveled looking guy about my age. And he was like, you know, are you taking a picture of my car? And I had this brief moment of trying to explain it where I just was like, no, I mean, I'm taking a picture of this restaurant. And it was clear that he didn't care. Like, it was a pretense, you know? He wanted to fight. It was a guy who wanted to fight. And so that interaction went on for a long time. And it went on for a long time because I also, what I realized later was, like, I also wanted to fight. Like, I didn't even know how, but I just wanted something to happen. I was so mad and so frustrated. He sort of kept trying to escalate it, and I kind of didn't stand down, but also didn't escalate it myself. And then at some point, I just was like, fine, and I walked away. And he followed
Please
me.
keep to the right in 100 yards onto A40, then keep to the right.
We just sort of flipped out, you know? Like, I kind of just lost it, and I got really angry, and I yelled at him, and, you know, I guess in that sense expressed my anger, and it scared him. Like, I scared him, and then he was like, whoa, okay, never mind, and, like, walked away. And that was such a weird, bad experience for me. And I realized, like, you know, there's really nothing that makes me different than this guy at this point. Like, what's so different, you know? And that's when I first really asked myself, like, why do men fight, you know? What, really, like, why?
Now, keep to the right.
Thomas, what drew you from that confrontation into the boxing ring? I mean, isn't that kind of the man box personified?
Yeah, I think what changed for me in that moment was that, and it's important to sort of say this, is that it's not the first time I asked this question. What is the relationship?
Route recalculation.
If somebody can give me a good answer in 5 minutes, I don't need to answer it viscerally myself. but I knew people couldn't, and I asked it so many times, so then I decided, well, why don't I find out?
In order to do that, Thomas decided he would launch himself into what seemed like the perfect place to find answers, the boxing ring. He linked up with a charity that staged boxing events where he would get several months of training. At the end of it, at just 5'5" and 130 pounds, he would take on an opponent at a very public event.
Yeah, it was a charity boxing outfit, and they said, yeah, we have a hole in the fight card. You have 5.5 months. As long as you can prove at the midpoint by sparring the guy that you'll eventually fight that you can, like, keep on your feet and not get knocked out, like, then let's do it. Let's make this happen. You can fight in Madison Square Garden in 5.5 months. So that was, from the beginning, what the goal was. It's a wild goal.
5.5 months to become a boxer. We'll hear how he fared in part 2 of Outlook. Now on the BBC World Service, today's BBC Minute update on the coronavirus.
Hello, it's Andrew and James. President Trump has defended his decision to downplay the risks of the virus early in the pandemic, saying he wanted to avoid panicking Americans. That's after an earlier interview was released in which he noted how deadly it was while publicly saying things were under control. Globally, COVID-19 deaths have now surpassed 900,000, with the US accounting for more than a fifth of those. The threat posed by the virus doubles every 6 years you age. So says a UK statistician. That would mean an average 26-year-old faces twice as high a risk of death as a 20-year-old, albeit a relatively small one. One of the world's biggest cities, Indonesia's capital Jakarta, plans to bring back a partial lockdown because case numbers appear to be taking off again there. There's no COVID-19 vaccine yet, but there are multiple trials at work and many false claims too. Just remember this mythbuster from the World Health Organization. Vaccines are very safe and most adverse reactions are minor and temporary.
BBC Minute. Still to come on Outlook, the first trans man to box at Madison Square Garden.
If you watch a boxing match, like, there's something so stripped bare about two people facing each other. There's like nothing.
Please turn right in 300 yards onto Water Street.
You can't run away from it. You have to actually face it.
What did Thomas McBee learn about masculinity, violence, and what it is to be a man? That's coming up after the latest headlines.
BBC News with Debbie Russ. The foremost opposition activist still inside Belarus, Maria Kolyasnikova, has said she was threatened with death by the KGB intelligence service agents who tried to deport her illegally this week. In a statement, she said she was told that if she didn't leave voluntarily, they would remove her anyway, alive or in pieces. The authorities accuse her of trying to organize a coup. Reports from Germany say the poisoned Russian opposition activist Alexei Navalny is able to speak again after being brought out of an induced coma earlier this week. Der Spiegel magazine said he may soon be in a position to tell investigators what happened before he fell ill last month. Efforts are underway on the Greek island of Lesbos to provide shelter for thousands of migrants stranded after a second fire.
Now turn right.
What is left of their makeshift camp. Many have slept rough on roads and in car parks. A major European Airlines consortium, IAG, is asking its shareholders for $3 billion of investment to offset the damage caused by the coronavirus pandemic. The group, which owns British Airways, has cancelled tens of thousands of flights. The Netherlands has offered to pay compensation to an Iraqi civilian who lost members of his family in a strike by the Dutch Air Force 5 years ago. It targeted 2 houses in Mosul, wrongly believing Islamic State militants were inside. The authorities in Colombia say 5 people have been killed during protests that broke out following the death of a man who was repeatedly tasered by police. Video showed him pinned to the ground by 2 officers in the capital Bogotá as he begged them to stop. Iran's navy has begun a major exercise near the strategically vital Strait of Hormuz. It's warned foreign aircraft, especially US drones, to stay away from the area. That's the latest BBC News.
Hello, I'm Anu Anand. Welcome back to Outlook. Thomas McBee is a trans man who wants to understand how society regards men and masculinity. After a childhood grappling with sexual abuse, he decides to embrace his gender identity and transition to a male body. But as soon as he does, he begins to notice that he's treated not only with more respect at work, but also with more menace and the threat of violence on the streets. So to explore the relationship between masculinity and violence, Thomas signs up to a charity boxing match. He will be the first trans man in the ring at Madison Square Garden in New York City, the site of the world's most iconic fights. But why on earth boxing?
I'd been a goalkeeper in soccer growing up, and I was used to being like hit in the face, so I kind of felt like I could handle that. What I felt apprehensive about was hitting someone else. And not because I didn't want to hurt anyone, but because I had a fear that maybe there was some sort of like rage in me that was really dark and deep, and that maybe I could actually really hurt someone and not be able to stop. That was my biggest fear. That somehow my transition or being a man or testosterone or something would make me so aggressive that I would really cause real harm to someone else.
Tell me about your sparring partners, because one of the first people you sparred with was a woman.
Yeah, I made a decision early on to not tell anyone related to the boxing that I was trans, because I was worried that it would be a mediating factor in how people treated me. And so my coach, this woman, Larissa, like nobody knew that about me. Larissa, the woman I was training with, was awesome. We were about the same size, and she really like wanted to help me get better. And there was sort of a thing in the boxing gym where like, you could be in the ring with a woman, but you had to always be defense if you were a dude. And we couldn't find sparring partners my size, so eventually, my coach and other people were kind of like pressuring me to fight her, and I felt really uncomfortable, and I didn't want to do it. And that was like kind of the first journey I went on, because I had to face my own bias and be like, what is the actual problem here? This woman is like the same size as me. She's actually way more experienced, but I really felt resistant. It was the first step on my journey of being like, I'm always been a feminist, but I want to be a better feminist in this body, and I don't think I'm being that right now. And so eventually, I did. I sparred her only once, and she totally kicked my ass. And and it was really important that we had that experience. And then the coach I had, ultimately, he wasn't a good fit, and he wasn't somebody who really, I think, believed I could do this. So right after that, I switched to a new coach and a new gym, and had sort of suddenly inherited like a whole group of, this time, all guys. And it was like a completely different environment. It was incredible, actually. It was a really supportive group of guys who just sort of embraced me immediately, and it really encultured me into boxing in a completely different way. And I realized how sort of vulnerable and intimate the sport it really was.
Tell me about that intimacy. I mean, what are you learning about yourself and about the men that you spar with as you're in the ring trying to make yourself want to hit people and survive? I mean, what does boxing reveal about the person?
Please turn left in 300 yards onto Knoll Street, then turn right.
Surprise. So like people often ask like at the beginning when they hear my story, like, why would you go into boxing if you were trying to not be a violent man? But there's something about, if you watch a boxing match, like there's something so stripped bare about two people facing each other. There's like nothing you can't see. I think that's very beautiful. And when you have a weakness in the sport, you can't run away from it. You have to actually face it. So when I was training with these guys, they each had strengths and they each had a weakness. And in the ring, there was no attempt to try to cover things or hide things. And in fact, people talked very openly about things they were scared of, what their vulnerabilities were as fighters, like what their vulnerabilities were as people, like whether or not they were getting enough sleep and eating well, and their breakups and their issues and their past, because there really was no way to not expose everything. And
now turn left.
People had to feel psychologically safe, and you had to really be able to be open to get better. So I learned so much so quickly about these random guys who I was spending literally all my time with. So I became very close to these men very quickly. And I also learned there's a lot of potential for intimacy in male relationships. And when you're all sort of speaking the same language and facing the same direction, of course, there's a real desire for care and compassion. Men are human beings, so like put us all in a room together and, push us in a direction of growth and tell us we have a few months to do something. Like, most people are going to want to do that in the best way possible.
Now turn right.
Incredibly healing, frankly, experience for me to...
You have reached your destination. Your destination is on the left.
What did she make of you coming home, every night with bruises and black eyes? And did she understand what you were trying to do?
She always supported what I was trying to do. I think we started dating right before my mom died, so it was sort of an intense moment to begin a relationship. Once she decided to be with me, I think she saw the shared value we have is facing, our ghosts and facing the truth and being really willing to engage with the things that are hard. So I think from that position, she absolutely understood it. From another position, I think she felt sometimes kind of worried. It was maybe scary to see me become the kind of man who could hit people. So I think she had her own journey, but she was always really supportive and I think really understood it.
So let's talk about the fight. You're supposed to fight this guy called Eric. He's been told that you're trans, and both of you are meant to hit 140 pounds in weight. So you need to gain some, he's supposed to lose some. Tell me about that moment that you entered Madison Square Garden. I mean, this is the moment it becomes totally real.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was wild.
I've seen a video of it. There are lights, there are crowds, there's your fight song.
Ladies and gentlemen, Thomas McPhee!
And you're jumping around with this nervous energy. Clearly, it's become real to you in a way, that it does suddenly when you're finally at that moment.
Yeah, I think that I felt I had done everything I was supposed to, and I hadn't really thought much beyond, I just need to get to the situation and show up, and then, of course, not get knocked out. That was my main goal. And I remember coming in, right before all the fights started and seeing, the stretcher that they bring in and they put next to the ring, which is just sort of, intense to be wow, okay, people could get really hurt, and I could get really hurt. I could theoretically die. I mean, something terrible could happen to me. But at the same time, I was, very happy that I'd gotten that far, and I think I realized in that moment too that I really was in Madison Square Garden. This wasn't a dream I'd had, it was a reality I was living. And yeah, I couldn't figure out what to do, so I just jumped up and down. The strength I had as a fighter was just energy. I just was very high energy and very resilient. So I remember coming down into the ring and jumping up and down and just trying to show everybody that I was ready and really that I was not going to stop.
And were you and Eric matched in weight in the end?
No, not at all. It was a disaster. We'd sparred when I had pretty much no training, so a couple months before that, and he'd really whooped me in the sparring, and he was way bigger than me. I think 20 pounds he'd had on me then, and so like you said, we were supposed to get within 10 pounds of each other. And I knew he came late, and he wasn't at the weigh-in, and so there was some question about if he was even going to show up. And then when he did show up, my coach went and checked on him, and he said, "I'm not going to tell you how much he weighs." And I kind of knew then, okay, this is not going to be an even match at all, because why would he say that, But I just tried not to think about it. I was 135, and I think he was 157, so a pretty dramatic weight difference. Not a fair fight at all.
But you did go the 3 rounds.
Yeah.
Tell me what happened in that first round.
The first round went great. The first round went shockingly well. And it was sort of the highlight of the whole experience for me. He was really lethargic and slow and didn't really seem like he wanted to be there. And I got a bunch of points, and he got what they call a standing 8 count, where it's you get hit so many times that the ref is okay, are you okay? We're going to count to 8 just to give you a breath kind of thing. So the first round I won, definitely. It was truly amazing. On some level, I didn't really totally believe I belonged in this situation until that first round was over. And then I felt I have every right to be here just like everyone else.
What were you thinking about as you punched Eric? I mean, were your thoughts focused at all on this journey and the whole masculinity thing, or at that point was it really just, I gotta stay on my feet?
I mean, I meditate, and it felt meditative. When I first got into the ring, I was so aware of all the people watching. There were so many people, thousands of people there, and it was kind of shocking to me. But then once the bell rang, it really did feel like there was no sound at all. I couldn't hear anything. It was my vision just sort of just tunneled in. And boxing is a kind of dance. It's again, a deeply intimate sport. So I think I wasn't thinking about anything intellectual, which was good for me. I was just truly embodied and truly present. I felt like I was really, for the first time, totally grounded in my male body.
The first round, as you just described, went brilliantly well. What happened in the next 2?
Didn't go as well after that. I think that, the second round went okay. It was maybe more of a draw. Something happened, with Eric and his coach between those rounds. And I, really wonder what the coach said to him, or, kind of what motivated Eric Haber to sort of come out fully again with his like power and his aggression. And then at that point, it was like, I was really outmatched. I mean, I don't want to make excuses, but it was a pretty big weight difference. It was pretty hard to fend him off. I might have won on points, but he definitely won on just having more power. And every time he hit me, it definitely looked worse. And then the third round, we were both really tired. I mean, even 3 rounds of 2 minutes each, it's hard to describe just how long that really is. But by the third round, we were sort of like wobbly, and I definitely, gassed out first. I was really tired and was just sort of focusing on staying upright and trying to hit him as much as I could. And he definitely got me good a few times in that last round. But at the end, I wasn't sure who won because the first round had gone so well, and then the second had been so kind of even. I wasn't sure where it was going to go in the end.
And where did it go in the end?
I didn't know. I lost, but it was so interesting to lose. I never really thought about winning. Like, that wasn't what the point of this all was for me. So my goal was to stand up, right?